the teaching learning session of sociology. This is ninth lecture in lecture series of sociology. In our last lecture, we discussed about tribes and castes of India. In this lecture, we'll discuss about classes in India. The class system is a system of stratification of society on the basis of education, on the basis of property, business, or work. Social class is one of the most important concepts that sociologists discuss. There are two classical sociologists who are most important in discussion about class, Karl Marx and Max Weber. The assertion of Karl Marx was that there were two great classes: the owners of the means of production, that is capitalist, and the second class is the workers class. The one thing that the worker owned was their ability to work, that Marx called a labor power, because owner or the capitalist paid wages to the workers and could for most part determine that wages. Owner had power over workers. Marx felt that lack of power of worker was source of exploitation, that was the basis of class conflict. Marx argued that owner and the worker developed ideas, understanding about their position, and this Marx called the class consciousness. Class consciousness is understanding about the positions. When owner convinced workers that their situations were compatible, this is called false consciousness. The other sociologist, Max Weber, argued that class referred to the economic interests. It was quantifiable economic positions, group of the groups that shares a common set of life chances and circumstances. Weber also talked about the status and prestige. There are certain bases for division of classes, and the common bases are property. On the basis of property, we can divide the class into capitalist and poor, the haves and have not. Second criteria is education, literate or illiterate. Another basis is business or occupation, farmers, clerk, officer, industrialist, etc. In general, class consciousness is must in a class system. There must be we feeling. Identifying oneself in a particular group or a family is the key of class. The behavior of person is fixed in their class consciousness. Trade union is the result of class consciousness. Class system is open in character. The people of lower class enters the upper class, and those of the upper class may become members of lower class. Various sociologists defined class in different ways. According to P. Gistberg, a social class is a category or group of persons having a definite status in society which permanently determine their relationship with other groups. Feeling of superiority or inferiorities are there. The reality position or the relative position of the class in social scale arises from the degree of prestige attached to the status. According to McIver and Page, a social class is any portion of community marked off from the rest of social status. Ogburn and Nimkoff described a social class is the aggregate of a person having essentially the same social status in a given society. That is a class consciousness. Max Weber held that classes are aggregate of individuals who have the same opportunities of acquiring goods. the same exhibit standard of living. Hobble defined a social class is a group within a society whose member had a number of distinctive status in common and who through the operation of roles associated with these status develop and the awareness of life interest as against the unlike traits and interest of other groups. There are certain characteristics of classes. First is the class system is based on occupation, it is based on wealth, education, age, and sex. Second characteristic is hierarchy of status group. In general, there are three classes: upper, middle, and lower class. Prestige and roles are attached with each class. Upper class are less in number in comparison to other two, whereas their status and prestige is most. This is like a pyramid. Feeling of superiority and inferiority. In these classes, there are such feelings that the upper class people feel that they are superior to other two, whereas the lower class feels it is inferior to upper class. Next characteristic of class is class consciousness. Wherever a class is found, this feeling, a consciousness is must. There should be feeling of in group, that is to class I belong to class is due to this the people of pre-literate class feel the upper class exploits them. Then they unite to revolt. The behavior action is determined by the class consciousness. The subclass is divided into different groups. Similar to caste, the classes system is divided. Class system is an open system. In class system, there is a social restrictions too, like there was in caste system. In general, there is endogamy in a class. To maintain their status and position, they mix among themselves. And it is seldom that marriages between upper and lower class is wished. The same was in the caste. We discussed about this in the last lecture. Distinction between the class and class. There are two phenomena of stratification. Stratification is division of society on the basis of birth. There are differences between class and the caste system. Caste is based on the birth, while class it is based on the birth, education, and occupation. In general, there are 3,000 castes and subcastes in India, whereas class has subclasses based on different things. Caste is a closed group, whereas class is an open group. Even Sanskritization is unable to change the class, whereas class can be changed quite easily. Caste is an ascribed status, while class is an achieved status. Caste is hereditary, while class is not. Caste is a closed class. A child of Brahmin will always be a Brahmin. But there is no such thing like in the class. Status is inborn and ascribed in caste system, whereas in class system it is acquired and achieved. In Indian society, caste and class as two different forms of social stratification have often been found to overlap with each other. Yogendra Singh mentions that in India, class is often subsumed by caste, while caste is perceived as a hereditary group. A social class is a category of people who share similar socio-economic status in relation to other segments of their community or society. Andre Bataille, on the basis of his study of caste and class in Siripuram in South India, found that the relation between the caste and the class has been dynamic one. In the traditional system, there was a greater similarity between caste and class, but the class system has gradually been disassociating itself from the caste structure. One can now achieve a variety of class positions with different degrees of probability, whatever one's position in the caste structure may be. Despite of your caste structure, you can achieve class. That's why class is an achieved status while caste is an ascribed status. Caste class are closely linked with the power structure, which is reflected in terms of the ownership of property such as land and political and economic standing in society. Social class has been defined as a kind of social group which is neither legally defined nor religiously sanctioned. It is generally defined as a stratum of people occupying a similar social position. Wealth, income, education, occupation are some of the basic determinants of the class. It is relatively open. That is, anyone who satisfies the basic criteria can become its member. There are several classes in society. These classes are hierarchically ranked primarily in terms of wealth and income. The difference of wealth and income are expressed in different lifestyles and consumption patterns. Social characteristics or social classes are characteristic features of industrial society. Classes arise due to industrial society. The capitalist society, we generally find the class of capitalist and working class. It is a good example of class. Social class in India had their genesis during British rules. The class dimension of Indian society was only less pronounced than it turned out to be during British period. A reason behind it is self-sufficiency of village community. Class at that time was overshadowed by the caste component. The only sphere where class dimension showed itself rather more sharply was in nature of interaction between the rulers and the ruled. The king and his courtiers represented a class quite different from the subjects over whom they ruled. There were classes like classes of administrative officers of various ranks, classes of merchant, artisans, and specialists of various kinds. The impact of British rule on class formation in India. British rule has a greater impact on the formation of class in India. Why? Because of change in agriculture. The emergence of new social classes in India was the consequence of far reaching changes brought about by the British in economic structure of India. The British administration revolutionized the existing land system. They made changes in the existing land system. It did away with the traditional right of village community over the village land. Instead, it created the individual ownership on the land by introducing several land reforms. The payment of revenue in cash gave push to production of cash crops in place of food crops. With expanding railways and transportation system, production for market became fairly well established. The commercialization of agriculture, in turn, stimulated the growth of trade and commerce in India. Trade and commerce were centered around two things. First was the supply of raw material for industries in Britain. Procuring of British manufacturing goods for consumption in India was another. The second factor had a disastrous effect on town and villages handicrafts. Village and town handicrafts could not stand the competition brought about by the import of goods from Britain and got disintegrated. And there was lack of sufficient industrial development in India. The result was that the emerging industry could not absorb the displaced population, which eventually fell on the already stagnant agriculture. There was a development of railway and industries in India. With the growth of trade and commerce, there was a rapid development of the transportation system in India. The railway expanded on an increasing scale from the middle of 19th century. These developments were undertaken with view to meet the raw material requirement of industries in Britain. The construction of railways and roads also gave the scope for investment of British capital in India. It led to the better mobility of troops and for establishment of laws and order. Investment of British capital found an outlet initially in spheres such as plantation, cotton, jute, and mining industries. This was the beginning of industrialization process in India. By then, there was accumulation of sufficient savings on the part of Indian traders and merchants. This served as a capital and made possible the creation of Indian owned industries. State and administrative system played an important role in formation of class. British government had organized a huge and extensive state machinery to administer the conquered territory. A large number of educated individuals were required to satisfy this. It was possible to secure the staff of educated people only from India for running such huge administrative machinery. It was not possible for Britishers to secure the staff of educated from Britain. The foreign ruler felt that there was a need for introduction of Western education in India because they needed an educated staff to run the state. Thus, the schools, colleges, universities were established to impart Western education in India and to cater to the needs of expanding economy and growing state machinery. As a consequence of the impact of British rules in India, the Indian society experienced an uneven growth of social class. The process of rise of new social class was an uneven one. This has given rise to the classes. This uneven growth during the British rule was responsible for the rise of classes. It didn't develop uniformly in different parts of the country and also among various communities. It was due to the fact that the social forces which developed during the British rule spread both in time and tempo unevenly. It was dependent on the growth of political power in India. It was in Bengal that the two of the social classes, that is Zamindar and tenants, came into existence first. Again, it was in Bengal and Bombay that the first industrial enterprises started. This led to the emergence of class of industrialists and worker in this region. It was for this region that British established a complex administrative system and introduced modern education first in Bengal and Bombay. The process of rise of new social classes among different communities was also uneven. It was due to the fact that the certain communities were already engaged in definite economic, social, or educational vocations in pre-British periods. For example, Baniyas were traders by vocation in our traditional social structure. Hence, they were the first to take up modern commerce, banking, and industrial enterprises. Brahmins were the first to take up modern education and enter the professional classes. Social classes in rural India. In rural India, classes consist principally of landlords, class of landlords. Second is class of tenants. Third, class of peasant proprietors. Then agricultural laborers and artisans. Landlords. The British administration made various types of land settlements, such as permanent settlements, Ryotwari settlements, and Mahalwari settlement with the natives. Under the permanent settlement, new type of landlords were created out of the previous tax collectors, and they were known as zamindars. Under the term of this settlement, the right of ownership was given to the zamindars. Before this settlement, the land used to be auctioned by the state on pattas, on which the zamindars only had the right to collect revenues. Now they become the owner of that land. After this settlement, this land become their permanent land and they become hereditary owner of this land. A son can inherit that land from the father. As a result of this arrangement, the peasants of this land were transformed into mass tenants in a day. This settlement was introduced by Lord Cornwallis in 1793 in the vast region of Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, and certain district of Madras. It was later introduced in UP and parts of Bombay, Punjab, Sindh, and so on. The zamindari settlement gave rise to the class of landlords. The rights of the ownership gave recognition to the right of mortgage and sale. Failure on the part of some zamindars to pay the fixed revenue led to the auction of the portion of a large estates. This in turn led to the entry of a new class of landlords who were primarily the merchants and the money lenders. Broadly, there were two types of landlords: the zamindars or talukadars, the old landlords, and the second is the money lenders or the merchant and others. Those who held such ownership of tenure rights in zamindari area were often referred to as intermediaries. These intermediaries were the various categories known by the class, different names and found in various regions of UP, Bengal, Bihar and Odisha. Talukadars were inferior intermediaries from the large zamindars, created out of their own zamindari rights. Jotedar found in some part of Bengal were substantial landlords who held land direct from the zamindar. They got land cultivated by subletting to tenants on a 50-50 ratio. Partidars held permanent leased at a fixed dues under the zamindars. Land reforms and its consequences. On the eve of independence, the class of intermediaries owned a large portion of land in their hands, while the peasant cultivators had a little or no land. There were extreme economic inequalities leading to a socio-political inequalities in Indian society. The first phase of the land reform was aimed at the abolition of zamindari system. The zamindari system was abolished in 1950 and the land reform was first implemented in Uttar Pradesh. The objective of this reform was to bring cultivators into direct relationship with the state. Hence, conferment of proprietary or occupancy rights on the actual cultivator tenants was a part of this measure. The abolition of zamindari system in 1950 had several consequences. It led to the formation of new classes. As a consequence of a new land reform, the zamindars forced most of the tenants out of these lands and declared the land which they were holding as khud khast. Thus, after the land reform, they simply came to be renamed as bhumidars, that is, cultivators of soil. The tenants who were actually cultivating the land prior to land reform were thrown out of their land, and most of them become landless agricultural laborers. It led to the pauperization of peasants. Thus, a new class of peasant proprietors or cultivator was formed who took up the agriculture as an enterprise. The land reform measure after independence failed to create a social homogeneous class of cultivators. The top strata of the agrarian hierarchy, the zamindar, lost their rights to extract taxes from peasants. They were left with truncated land holdings. The economic, political, and social supremacy was also broken. Hence, they could no longer enjoy the kind of control they used to exercise over peasants. They have taken to active participation in management and improvement of the farm. They have also brought about the radical changes in method of agricultural production. The former landlords and some of the ex-tenants thus became the forerunner of capitalist trend in Indian agriculture. These changes had led to the development of a class of gentlemen or progressive farmer who had some education and often training in agriculture. These farmers had taken up agriculture as a business. They invest money in agriculture, which have they grow the cash crops, which have higher cash. They read the reports of experts, use the best seeds and fertilizers. Next class is peasant proprietors. Another settlement made by the British is known by the name of Royatwari settlement. This was introduced in the Madras, Bombay Presidency in 19th century. Under this settlement, ownership of land was vested in the peasants. The actual cultivators were subjected to payment of revenue. This settlement was not a permanent settlement and was revised periodically after 20 or 30 years. It did not bring into existence a system of peasant ownership. Instead, the cultivator comes into direct contact with state, which replaced the oppressive role of landlords. This settlement thus gave rise to a class of peasant proprietors. The process of differentiation was at work amongst the peasant proprietors. In the process, a few climbed up in socio-economic hierarchy, but the large number fell from the previous rank and position. A great majority of them were transformed into tenants and even agricultural laborers. This showed a large scale passing of land from the actual cultivators to not only those of money lenders, merchant, and others, but also to the certain section of peasant proprietors who had become rich peasants. The peasant proprietors may be broadly divided into three categories: the rich, the middle, and the poor peasants. Rich peasants, they are the proprietors with considerable holdings. They perform no field work but supervise cultivation and take personal interest in land management and improvement. They are emerging into strong capitalist farmer groups. Another is middle peasants. They are the landowners of medium sized holdings. They are generally self sufficient. They cultivate land with family labors. Third is poor peasants. They are the landowner with holding that are not sufficient to maintain a family. They are forced to rent in others' land or supplement income by working as laborers. They constitute a large segment of agriculture population. The peasant proprietors had been instrumental in bringing about a great change in class Indian agriculture, especially in Punjab, Haryana, Western UP, Karnataka, and Bihar. This change is known as Green Revolution. The role of such peasant was crucial in this change. Tenants. The creation of zamindari settlement transformed the owner cultivators of pre-British India into class of tenants. The zamindars resorted to the practice of extracting the excessive rent from tenants. Those who failed to pay were evicted from the land and were replaced by those ready to pay higher rents. Broadly, then, there were two categories of tenants in zamindari area: tenants under zamindars and tenant under lease. Tenants under tenure holder were thus subtenants. Various categories of tenants under subtenants too had grown up in Bengal. The lowest in the hierarchy was sharecroppers. This process of creating tenants and subtenant is called subinfeudation. Legislation was passed from time to time in various parts to protect the interest of tenants. This did give some protection to the affluent category of tenants. The lower, impoverished category of tenant remained unprotected. On the eve of independence, there were various categories of tenants. Broadly, they could be classified as tenants, subtenants, and sharecroppers. Tenancy reforms become an important component of land reform program. The provision under the reform were regulation of rent, security of tenure, and ownership of tenants. However, there was not much success due to loopholes in programs and its implementation. The benefits of reform of this mainly went to affluent section of tenant class. Sharecropper, on the other hand, gained little from these programs. Sharecropper constitutes the most important, if not the only segment of the tenant class in rural India today. Organizationally and politically, they are weak, though they form a very important component of peasant organization in India. Next class is agricultural laborers. Non cultivating landlords, peasants, proprietors, and tenants are not the only social group connected with the agriculture. There was also progressive rise in number of agricultural laborers. The growing indebtedness among the peasants' population, followed by the land division and displacement of village artisans, was largely responsible for this. The agricultural laborers were and still are broadly of three types. Some owned or held a small plot of land in addition to drawing their livelihood from the sale of their labor. Others were landless and lived exclusively on hiring out of their labor. In return of their labor, the agriculture laborers were paid wages which were very low. Their condition of living was far from satisfactory. Wages were generally paid in kind, that is, food grains like paddy, wheat, and pulses. Sometimes cash was paid in lieu of wages in kind. There was another type of labor prevailing in many parts of the country. Their status was almost that of bondage or semi bondage. The land reform program after independence have done almost nothing to improve the condition of agricultural labor in India. Resumptions of land by landlords for personal cultivation and eviction of tenants from their tenure have been a factor leading to this trend. The process was further accelerated by Green Revolution. Another class is artisans. In rural area, this class forms an integral part of the village community. They have existed since the ancient period, contributing to general self-sufficient image of an Indian village. Some of these are like carpenters or bahai, ironsmith, potters, and so on. Not all villages had families of these artisans, but under Jajmani system, sometimes a family of these occupational castes served more than one village. Craftsmen were hard hit under the British rule. They could not compete with the mass manufactured goods produced by the British industries. The destruction of village art and craft led to deindustrialization of rural economy. After independence, the Indian government has taken several steps to improve the conditions of this class. The class in the rural area is not homogeneous. In their own group, there are some who are highly skilled and some semi skilled or less skilled. Thus, socially, all of them cannot be ranked in one class. In broad sense, we can consider them as class by virtue of their occupation. These were the classes in rural India. Now we'll discuss about the social classes in urban India. In urban India, social classes comprises the capitalist, commercial and industrial. Second is the corporate sector. Third, professional classes. Fourth, petty traders and shopkeepers. Fifth, working class, commercial and industrial classes. Under the British rule, production in India became production for market. As a result of this, internal market expanded and class of traders engaged in internal trading grew. Simultaneously, India was also linked up with the world market. This led to the growth of class of merchants engaged in export-import business. Thus there came into being commercial, middle class and country. Indians lagged far behind in comparison to the British in these activities. Government policy was mainly responsible for their slow development during the colonial period. The conflict of interest with British led the formation of independent organization by Indian commercial and industrial classes. This class participated in freedom struggle by rallying behind the professional classes who were backbone of Indian national movement. With the attainment of independence, emphasis was laid on the rapid industrialization of the country. In this process, the state was to play a very active role. It evolved economic and industrial policies which clearly indicated that the role of commercial and industrial class as a catalyst in industrialization in India. The mixed type of economy led to the phenomenal rise in number of industries owned and controlled by capitalists. It also led the rise of commercial classes. The commercial and business class has therefore grown in scale and size in past and post-independence area. There is a growing tendency towards inequality amongst industrial classes. The another class is corporate sector, the joint stock organization, which is otherwise popularly known as corporate sector. Indian corporate sector is substantially large and highly diversified. The third class is professional classes. The new economic and state system brought about by the British rule required cadres of educated Indian trained in modern law, technology, medicines, economics, administrative science, and other subjects. Schools and colleges giving legal, commercial, and general education were started to meet the need of the state and the economy. Thus, there come to being an expanded professional class. Such social categories were linked up with modern industry, agriculture, commerce, finance, administration, press, and other fields of social life. The professional classes comprises the modern lawyers, doctors, teachers, managers, and other working in modern commercial and other enterprises. Officials functioning in state administrative machinery, engineers, technologists, agricultural scientists, generalists, and so on. The role of this class in the national movement was decisive. They were in fact pioneers and pace setters. They were also the force behind the progressive social and religious reform movements in country. Rapid industrialization and urbanization in post-independent India has opened the way of large-scale employment opportunities in industries, trade, commerce, construction, transport, services, and other varied economic activities. This class, however, hardly constitute a homogeneous category. However, even with this non-proprietary class of non-manual workers, a deep hierarchy exists. There are some high-paid cadres at the top. The large proportion, on the other hand, has earning only a little above those of non-manual workers. There are also considerable difference in the conditions of their work and opportunities for promotions. They differ in their style of life as well. In view of these observations, we can say that there are only gradual crystallizing into a well defined middle class. Next class is petty traders, shopkeepers, and unorganized workers. They also exist in the urban area. These classes have developed with the growth of modern cities and towns. They constitute the link between the producers of goods and commodities and the mass of consumers. They make their living on the profit margin of the prices on which they buy and sell their goods and commodities. Like all other classes, this class also has grown in scale in post independent India. The unprecedented growth of cities in the process of urbanization, which the post independent India has become witnessed to, has stimulated the growth of this class. Society has led to a large scale migration of rural population to the towns and cities in search of employment. Urbanization, on the other hand, offers a variety of new activities and employment. The growing urban population creates a demand for various kinds of needs and services. Besides these spheres of activities, urbanization also offers opportunities for employment in organized and unorganized sector of economy. The opportunities in organized sector are small and require educational qualification and training. The bulk of rural migrants lack the prerequisites, and hence the organized sector is closed to them. They work in small scale production units or crafts, industry, or manual service occupation. They get low wages and also are deprived of the benefits the organized labor force are entitled to. Economic liberalization since 1991, there is now a trend towards deregulation of labor market, which may make labor relations in an unorganized sector more exploitative. Although economic liberalization is affecting the organized workers directly, they may be considerable impact the unorganized workers. This class also constitutes an amorphous category. It comprises of one hand class self-employed petty shopkeepers, traders, vendors, hawkers, and so on. Others semi-skilled or unskilled worker in informal sector. They are the least organized of the urban group in India. Next class is working classes. This was the modern working class, which was direct result of modern industries, railways, plantation established in India during British period. This class grew in proportion as factories, mining, industries, transportation, railways, and other industrial sector developed and expanded in India. The Indian working class was formed predominantly out of peasants and ruined artisans. Level of living and working conditions characterized their existence. A large portion of them generally remained indebted because of their inability to maintain themselves and their families. This hard condition of life and labor led to the emergence of trade unions and growth of the working class movement in India. This was evident from the participation of workers in strikes and other activities launched by the trade union from time to time. As a result, there was a considerable improvement in the wage structure and working condition of the working class population in India. In India, there was a rapid industrialization after independence. In view of this, working class has grown in volume of post-independent India. They have also been dispersed to different parts and different sectors of the industries. The working class has become much more heterogeneous. It consists of workers employed in different type of industries that have different social and historical background. This diversity in the working class has given rise to a complex set of relations among the different sectors. So let's now sum up. Today we discussed about classes, social classes. Social classes constitutes the important segment of social structure in modern India. Social classes have also been present through all ages, but the social classes, as we see them today in India, had their origin in the British rule. We discussed about the impact of British rule on the class formation in India. In this connection, we discussed the creation of new economy in British India. This reflected in the agriculture sector in form of introduction of private property in land, new revenue system, and the increasing commercialization of agriculture, which was a consequence of agrarian reforms introduced after independence. The other sphere of this new economy were the growth of trade and commerce, extension of railways, introduction and expansion of industrial enterprises. The development of state and administrative system coupled with modern education were other important social forces which shaped a new classes in India. In the process, we also pointed to the consequent uneven growth of social classes in different parts and communities in India. We then studied the rural classes in India. We classified them broadly into five divisions such as landlords, peasant proprietors, tenants, agricultural laborers, and craftsmen. Each was studied with reference to its emergence and character. Major changes in their composition after independence were pointed out. Similarly, urban classes were divided into five categories. These comprised commercial and industrial classes, the corporate sector, professional classes, petty traders, shopkeeper, and unorganized workers and working class. They too were studied with reference to their emergence, character, and changing situation in post independence India. We discussed about the difference in caste and class, right? As we discussed, the caste is an ascribed status while class is an achieved status. We discussed about the ascribed status and achieved status in our previous lectures, right? Then we discussed about the various definitions given by the various sociologists about the class. We discussed about the Karl Marx and Max Weber's point of view. Karl Marx assertion was that there were two great classes, the owner of the means of production and the workers. And according to Max Weber, the class referred to as economic interest. It was a quantifiable economic position, groups that share a common set of life chances and circumstances. Then we discussed about the various characteristics of class system. Class is based on occupation, wealth, education, age, and sex. It has hierarchy of status group. There is we feeling and feeling of superiority and inferiority. Class consciousness is a characteristic of a class. Then class is divided into various subclasses. Important about class is it is an open system, while caste is closed system. Class is an open system, but here too the social restrictions are there. It is endogamy. To maintain the status and position, they mix among themselves. There are certain do's and don'ts defined even in classes, like in caste. In Indian society, caste and class are the two different forms of social stratification and often been found to overlap with each other. While caste is a hereditary group, class is not because it is an achieved status. Social class is a category of people who share a similar socio-economic status in relation to other segment of their community or society. In this lecture, we discussed about the class. In our previous lecture, we discussed about caste. In our next lecture, we'll discuss about marriage and kinship. That's all for today. Thank you very much.